Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Production Value Sphere podcast, which is shot from my terraced hideout in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. I have with me a very, very smart guest. Brad, one of the previous guests on this podcast was our common friend Gabriel Rossman. And when I had him on, I asked him to justify the existence of sociology as an academic discipline. And when I think of how sociology can actually be like a useful and interesting discipline, I think about you because over the years you've produced so much work that sort of puts numbers and data and uses empirical methods to sort of confirm what we all know or what we sense about the family relationships and that entire area. And you did something even more interesting, which is and impressive, which is that you started an organization called the Institute for Family Studies, which has been growing enormously, being very successful in terms of building its influence in the policy world, in the discourse, as overused as that word is. So I guess my first question is, tell us about what IFS is, what you do, the main initiatives. How do you pitch it?
Yeah, thanks, Pascal. So I think that the main story of the IFS, the Institute for Family Studies, is that we're really kind of dedicated to underlining all the ways in which families matter for children, for adults, and for our civilization. And as we've kind of grown and expanded, we've come to realize that one of the main threats to flourishing families, Pascal, is the rise of new technologies that kind of distract us from in-person relationships and kind of end up degrading our capacity to connect with others, including with potential, romantic partners who obviously might become spouses um, and parents with us later. So that's sort of one dimension of our work is kind of marriage, family, and technology now. And then we've also kind of added a new track headed up by Lyman Stone on the importance of kind of thinking about the future of fertility. And it's our new pronatalism initiative. So Lyman's heading up the pronatalism wing of IFS. Michael Toscano is doing the family and technology wing, and I'm focusing on the marriage side of our work. But again, the broader point is we think that we need to be kind of reminded of all the ways in which families matter for human flourishing, kids, adults, and the civilization at large. And that's what we're about.
That's thank you. That's great. You do excellent work. I had Lyman on to talk about the natalism stuff. And he's very good, obviously. I just want more, sort of stories. Can you tell me what it was like to start IFS and sort of the story of why you decided to start it and sort of how it grew into this very important thing that it is now? Because I remember, like you were a professor at the University of Virginia. You I think you were sort of part time originally. Like it was the IFS was just you part time at the start, or am I wrong about that? And now it's this significant organization. So why did you decide to sort of embark on this adventure of sort of policy entrepreneurship? And what was that like?
Well, Pascal, there were kind of a number of think tanks in the mix, obviously, in American life, from Heritage on the right to Brookings on the center left. And, about 13 or 14 years ago, there wasn't really a kind of an American think tank focusing on family. And so I and some other scholars like Scott Stanley at the University of Denver were kind of talking about this and just thinking that there was a need for a new think tank focusing on family. And that was kind of the genesis of this. I still teach at the University of Virginia. I still, do research at UVA. I'm still employed by UVA, but I work with other scholars and, some colleagues and staff to start this nonprofit in Charlottesville. And then we brought in Michael Toscano about 5 years ago, and he's been very successful in kind of building up our internal capacities. Then can kind of run across Lyman Stone on the internet, on Medium, actually, and see that he seems to be an important voice on the fertility front. And we incorporated him into our work as well. And so just been a kind of place where people who are broadly kind of interested in the character and the quality and the future of family have kind of convened. And my main job is at UVA. I do things kind of on a very part-time basis at IFS, but we now have a kind of a staff there, including Dr. Wendy Wang, who can kind of do their own research for IFS. And we also have a number of young kind of hires who are also just cranking out numbers and statistics as well. And I'm hopeful because they kind of represent the future for the broader pro-family scholarship and policy work that IFS is now about.
Yeah, that's great. So now I wanted to talk about your story because again, I think it's so impressive. But I'm going to ask you about your research now. You've published so much stuff on family and sort of debunking ideas that are prevalent in the culture about the family, or to the contrary, sort of confirming. Um, and one of my favorite findings of yours, one which I find myself sharing a lot on social media and like angrily sending to people in group chats, relates to sex. Um, and, it's one of those things. People who are married have more sex. And when you think about it, it's obvious because, when you share a bed with another person, you know, it's easier to have sex than when you're alone in your bed. But actually, if you look at popular culture, the image in popular culture is that when you're single, it's this sort of never ending bacchanal of nightclubs and sexual encounters. And meanwhile, every married couple on television is sort of, unhappy and pointedly not having sex. Like it's a total trope on popular culture, the married couple that's miserable because the couple is not having sex. Uh, so can you give us some more detail on, sex and the married couple? Like the numbers, who has more versus less sex. Also, it's better sex is one of your findings. I mean, I'm going to let you go on there.
Yeah, so Pogobri, this story is an interesting one. It's actually gotten more complicated, I think, in recent years, and I'll come back to that in a second. But it's really in case that work that we've seen done over the years from Linda Waite at the University of Chicago, and from and Lyman Stone more recently with IFS, among others. Just tells us that sexual frequency is much more common. Again, this is not rocket science for married folks compared to single folks. Now, where it's a little bit complicated, Pascal, is that cohabiting couples, in part because they tend to be younger in their relationship, actually have more sex than married couples. So and I think this is an issue of kind of like often the kind of the timing. So when people are first, together physically,
Right, right.
there's a kind of a novelty and a freshness there, right? And that just translates into more sex, right? The problem with cohabitation is it's not very stable, and so people who are not getting married, and if they're cohabiting, often will end up splitting up. So cohabitation often leads to kind of being single again down the road. That's the main point about cohabitation and sex. But in terms of married, folks versus unmarried folks more broadly, married folks have more sex and they're happier. But what we are seeing more recently is a little bit of there's a kind of complication that is that sex is down for everyone, including married folks. This is
Right.
Gene Twenge's work. And the newest wrinkle on this that comes out in my book to some extent, Get Married, as well as in just some continuing work I'm doing with the General Social Survey, is we're now seeing that less than half of more secular couples have sex at least once a week. That is, folks who are married, um, which is down. And at the same time, more than half of religious married couples have sex at least once a week. So what's kind of striking about this, Pascal, is that in 2000, there was no gap in sexual frequency between religious and secular couples who are married in America. Today, there is. I'm going to do a piece on this soon, hopefully, for IFS. And I would attribute this to a number of things. One is that I think the kind of the competition that pornography and that, just screen time and Netflix and all that stuff kind of exerts from like real sex is more salient, I think, today, and especially maybe for more secular
That's
couples.
fascinating.
And then for religious couples, I think the other piece here is they may be more likely to, kind of be a bit more ascetical in the technology, which is helpful for their sex life. But I think the other piece that's unrecognized is sort of the importance of generosity in marriage, right? Generosity when it comes to sex. And I think for people who haven't been married or who are newly married, you can kind of like, you may not get it, right? But for a lot of couples, once you've been married 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, generally speaking, and of course there are exceptions, you always have to, mention the exceptions, but for academics and other types, generally speaking, obviously, husbands tend to want more sex than wives. And so that creates a challenge in.
That's the first time I've heard of this.
I know it's shocking news, breaking news from Brad Wilcox. But that's obviously creates some tension in marriage, right? And so I think the sort of the way in which religious couples have an edge here, Pascal, is that they are more likely, and actually my data support this in the YouGov survey we did for my book. It looks like religious wives are more likely to have sex when they're not entirely into it, right? At the same time, so they're generous, right? At the
Yeah,
same
yeah, yeah. I'm laughing, but what you say makes total sense.
Right, but it's key that this is a two-way street here. But at the same time, it looks like they also they also kind of are reporting too that their husbands are more kind of considerate when they make it clear that they are not interested in having sex. So the point is
Ah, I
both
see.
husbands and wives kind of try to embrace a spirit of generosity in this domain, where the wives are more likely to kind of go forward with this when they're not entirely in the mood, so to speak. And at the same time, husbands seem to be more likely to kind of rein in you know, their desire when they can clearly see that their wives are not, in the mood for
That's fascinating.
So, but anyways, the bottom line is that today we're, yes, married couples have more sex than single, adults, no question. But there's a religious gap that's emerged in favor of those married couples in the U.S. who are more religious.
That's fascinating. I don't know to what extent I want to push the sex discussion. I know you and I have talked about this in private. Um, like the thing I've tweeted a number of times, because this is a topic that recurs on social media endlessly, is the wife needs to make an effort on quantity and the husband needs to make an effort on quality. And if they both do that, then they'll be fine, because it'll be easier for the wife if the sex is better, and so on and so forth. And it sounds like you're saying something that's sort of proximate to that. And I love the notion of generosity, which in a sense is what this is. I want to do a sidebar, or my next question, about, unless you want to expand on that, about
Well, I would just say,
methodology.
I think it's important to note that for both actually men and women, there's a way in which kind of commitment, trust, and emotional security seem to be related to higher quality sex. And we see this
Right.
not just in a religious context, but just
Yes.
kind of more generally in the research that I've run across. So that's, I think, worth thinking about. And um, I think, yeah. So certainly, quality is important, and that's more likely to be kind of taking place in a context where people
Yes.
really feel safe emotionally in their marriage.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and that's another thing that your research shows. It's this sort of thing that's obvious when you think about it, except that the culture tells you the opposite, which is actually sex with somebody who you know well and who you love and who loves you is actually better than sex with a complete stranger who you don't know and who you don't particularly have feelings for, and who doesn't particularly have feeling for you. It's actually kind of it's actually kind of extremely meh. But again, it's a total trope in popular culture, the sort of two random strangers who have this sort of mind-blowing sex. That's a TV trope. And there's the other TV trope of the sort of completely boring, unpleasurable married sex. uh yeah, no, I wanted to ask you about methodology, because as I say, like, I keep sharing your research, sending it to people in group chats and so on and so forth, and sometimes people will be like, oh, that's like a right wing sort of attack shop, it's fake, it's not. And I tell, like, you're a real academic sociologist. Like, you're still a professor in good standing at the University of Virginia, which is one of the great universities in America. The other people who do research for IFS have, they have proper PhDs and so on and so forth. Most of your data, or all of it, I don't know. I want you to answer this question. Is from the General Social Survey, which is a sort of data set that's put together by the U.S. government. That's publicly available. Anybody can reproduce your research. Yeah, could you just talk about the methodology of your studies and just explain for the record that you're not making it up. You're not when you say your results, you're not asking like 12 people and saying
Yeah.
this
No,
represents.
it's a good question, Pascal. And I would say I want to make 2 points here quickly. One is that, I had a big tenure battle at UVA. I lost at every level of the tenure process at UVA. And one of the allegations that was lodged against me was that I was just kind of like cooking the books empirically in my research. And so that's why they didn't want to give me tenure at the University of Virginia. Now, thankfully, the provost at the end of the process overturned the earlier decisions and gave me tenure. Grateful for that, obviously. But the irony, though, is that when they made that allegation, I was working with a colleague, Nicholas Wolfinger, who is, secular, Jewish, progressive guy, another sociologist, UCLA trained. And he was the one crunching the numbers. So we were doing this joint work on religion and urban relationships and finding that religious couples, Black, Hispanic, some white, in urban America were happier in their relationships than their more secular peers. And this was kind of deemed to be kind of just, more ideologically driven stuff, not accurate. And what they didn't know really is that, again, my more secular progressive colleague was the one actually crunching the numbers on this large longitudinal data set. And so I am committed to kind of letting the facts speak for themselves. And the vast majority of work that I do is done with publicly accessible data sets like the General Social Survey. And so if people are skeptical of my claims, they're free to kind of jump on the on the internet and download the data and run the numbers themselves. The second thing that I would say is that I'm also, I mean, well, so I'll say three things. The second thing that I would say quickly is that, there are times when I've kind of come across findings that surprised me and didn't conform to my worldview. So I did a project on paternal presence and kids' educational attainment around the globe, and found that in some places, Pascal, when dad is, in the home, no positive effect on kids' education. And I was surprised, didn't expect to find that. But I did find that. And then, of course, I tried to figure out why is it in some countries, in some contexts, having a father present does not, predict kids' educational success. And that's a different story. But again, the point is that I did kind of publish this research, which went against my priors. And the final point I would make here is that a lot of the work that I do is cross-sectional. And so I think the legitimate kind of concern here is, does, for instance, marriage actually causally predict outcomes for kids and for adults, rather than just being kind of a manifestation of having some underlying good traits, whether they're genetic or environmental or advantages. And so there, I think the challenge is more profound. And there are some newer kind of methodologies that, I can point to, like twin studies, for instance, that lend greater empirical kind of evidence to this idea that marriage is a
Yeah, but
causal
I mean,
impact.
this problem is a problem with all
A lot
empirical
of
social
research, yeah,
science,
yeah.
right?
So
I
but
mean,
it's legit.
I used to have this thing, if you look at the way, so there, and you know this stuff better than I do, there's very famously a college wage premium, and there's very famously a marriage wage premium. So people who are married make more money, and people who go to college make more money. If you look at the way this is described in the in the literature, it's almost opposite, meaning people will always tell you that the marriage wage premium is a selection effect. But they will almost and like you can flip the arguments both ways, and like the sentences would work, and it's clearly people's priors that lead them to think that college is a valuable thing, whereas marriage isn't. But that's a problem with social science in general. But just just want to see you, make clear that you use the best standards of social science, which means you still have the limits of social science, but you're not doing some weird thing. You're using the same standards as any research that could be published in a peer-reviewed journal.
Yeah, that's so. That's right. And again, I think some work that I do is for peer-reviewed, journals these days, but other work is done just for, a broader public audience. And I think it's also just important to note, though, too, that in a context where on the left we hear things like in the New York Times, there was a piece that said that married heterosexual motherhood in America is a game that no one wins. And she was talking about women. And so the idea there on the left oftentimes is that for women, marriage and motherhood are kind of a pathway to misery, and even in some
Right.
context, immiseration. Of course, now on the right, what we're getting is a different message, but very kind of similar in other regards, and that is, people like Andrew Tate saying that for men, marriage is a dead end path, and that
Right.
men should not invest in family lives. And so, I think one of the hopefully services that I'm performing is that I can show empirically at the cross sectional level that the average man and the average woman in America who are married with kids are markedly happier and report more meaningful lives than their peers who aren't married with kids. And so kind of at least the sort of average story that we're seeing play out in the American context runs directly in the face of these Brooklyn progressives and these red pill rightists online. And that's, I think, helpful in kind of just correcting the record.
That's great. And that's a great segue to my next question. So you have this book, which is titled Get Married, which from the title, I think it's a book that's encouraging people to get married. Am I getting that right? Yeah. Why don't you tell us about the book, what the argument in the book is, what the research behind the book is?
Yeah. So as I've been kind of doing the work of writing and researching, teaching about family, my first motivation in doing all this was kind of just showing how much marriage matters for kids. And it's a bit, to be honest, personal. I was raised by a single mom, and I kind of realized in college that marriage was the institution that kind of connected dads to their children. And so a lot of my work historically has been about how much marriage matters for kids. But as I've been talking to students, particularly to younger women, there's been kind of this reoccurring theme that they're really concerned about their prospects for marriage. They have the sense that there aren't enough marriageable men out there. It's harder to date guys who are really, worthy of commitment or interested in commitment.
Right.
And so I wanted to kind of reorient the discussion away from just the importance of marriage for kids and towards kind of the importance of marriage for adults. And then to give, women and men who are considering marriage or who are already married some kind of guidelines about how to forge a strong and stable marriage. And so that's kind of the genesis of the book. And again, the book is Get Married and Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. The the Defy the Elites, idea kind of got immediate flack from Matt Iglesias when the title first came out. He's like, "What are you talking about, Brad? The elites are the ones succeeding at marriage." Ironically, Matt himself had published a piece in, I think it was in Vox, a while back, kind of saying that the decline of marriage was not a problem for, for our country. And so unwittingly, Matt was kind of exhibit A about why the elites need to be defied. And here he was making the case a number of years ago. I think he's actually evolved on this, but a number of years ago, kind of suggesting that the institution of marriage was not important for our country. And that's the kind of thinking that I'm obviously trying to counter in the book. And then in terms of forging strong families, I kind of lay out 5 C's: communion, children, commitment, cash, and community, that I think are the pillars of strong and stable marriages today, and kind of give us some confidence when we're kind of worrying about the messages from the left and now the red pill right that would kind of tell us that there's no way to forge a good marriage in today's world. There are good ways to do that, and I lay them out in the book. And the final piece is just kind of underlying all the ways in which, or the most important ways in which, marriage matters for our civilization. And we could talk a lot about that, but I would just kind of give you one example. We've seen a decline in happiness in America. So kind of people are not realizing
Yes.
that Jeffersonian pursuit, the pursuit of happiness, as much in America today. And there's a recent, of course, Chicago study that tells us that the number one factor there, that it explains why Americans are less likely to be happy today, is because fewer Americans are married today. So that's just one example of how,
Oh.
fortunes of the family really kind of affect the fortunes of our country.
Oh, that's very interesting and very sad. So we don't have a lot of time because I know you have a plane to catch. Because you're a very busy and important man, which is great. But so in preparing for this interview, I sort of looked around at the stuff you'd written recently and the stuff that IFS published recently, and I noticed that you'd written about a theme which is near and dear to my heart, which is one, well, which is very sad, but also, I have to admit, kind of funny, which is the phenomenon of unhappy liberal women. Uh, why are liberal women so, well, first of all, how unhappy are liberal women? Why are they so unhappy? And why is this important?
Yeah, great question, Pascal. And so there's actually been, a good bit of work done by people like Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt, who are obviously very prominent social psychologists, and some earlier grad students who kind of caught this story with Pew data, a while back, and about 5 years ago, really, to be more precise. And what they were finding is that there was more kind of reports of mental illness, like depression and anxiety, et cetera, things like that, among more progressive women in particular. And by contrast, conservative men and conservative women were doing much better on the sort of mental uh, health, end of things. And of course, then I wanted to look at just the happiness piece, since the happiness piece I think is so important in the American context, especially, and found that similar pattern there, that basically liberals are less happy than conservatives, and for liberal women, they're about twice as likely to be not happy with their lives compared to conservative women. And then when you kind of flip it, in our most recent research at these family studies, we find that conservative women aged 18 to 40 about 3 times more likely to be completely satisfied with their lives. And as we kind of explain this, we kind of reference a broader discussion from people like Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge, and then also on the left, Matt Iglesias and Michelle Goldberg in terms, who kind of think this is about a mindset issue. They think that liberal women are more likely to catastrophize, to have kind of like negative thoughts about the world based upon social media consumption and other factors in their lives. And so they kind of think this is just about a bad mindset, makes them more likely to just sort of look at the world through a dark lens rather than through a rose colored lens. So that,
Yeah, but this is sort of pushing back the question one step, because somebody who has that mindset is somebody who's already not doing well. And also, it's the opposite of the stereotype about conservatives. It's the conservatives who's supposed to think that everything is going to hell in a handbasket, that,
yeah.
who's supposed to look at the world through a dark lens and, maybe correctly, right?
Mhm.
But so anyway, go on.
Yeah, so the idea was this is all about the mindset, and I don't want to minimize the mindset, right? That's I think that's an important part of the puzzle. But what we find in our own research in looking at the factors that help to explain this ideological divide for younger women, in this case, women aged 18 to 40, in our most recent research, we find that dramatic differences in marital status, in religion, and reports of loneliness really do a great job of explaining this gap empirically between liberal and conservative women. So we're just kind of making the additional point that is indebted to you, so in a sense, your forebearer from France, Emile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, that people's social integration into core institutions and communities is incredibly important for their well-being. And today, conservative women are more likely to be integrated into core institutions like marriage, religion, and maybe other kinds of community. And that's the thing that really helps to explain not just mindset differences, these gaps between the well-being of conservative women and liberal men.
Okay, so talk more about the loneliness bit, because, well, first of all, you might want to explain. Like, I take this for granted, but first, it is a fact that on average, religious people and people who attend religious services, particularly Christians and Jews, I think, are happier. This is something that most people may not be aware of. But can you, why are liberal women so lonely? Yeah, I mean, why?
Yeah, so one of the things, just kind of illustrate the point, Pascal, is that Gallup was tracking kind of, I think, happiness or satisfaction across the pandemic, right? and found the only group of Americans who did not see a dramatic dip in their like happiness or satisfaction across the pandemic, back in 2020 and 2021, were Americans who regularly attended religious services. So just kind of being part of a community where there are common rituals, there are, social gatherings happening. There's kind of a sense that life is meaningful, all the stuff you can kind of, linked to religion, is linked to, less depression, less anxiety, and greater happiness for ordinary Americans. Um, and then when it comes to obviously marriage, much the same story. And so what we see in this new research we did is that only 31% of liberal women are married, compared to 51% of conservative women. Only 12% of liberal women attend services regularly, religious services regularly, compared to 55% of conservative women. So again, a majority of conservative young women are religious and married. Only a minority of liberal women are married and religious. And so, again, these differences in social integration help to explain why one group is more likely to be flourishing and one group is more likely to be floundering.
That's fascinating. Sad, but fascinating. Um, let's see what else I have here. Well, you know what? I'm not gonna make you be late for your flight, so I'm gonna ask you the traditional final question that we ask every guest on the show, which is recommend a book. It can be any book, fiction, nonfiction, old, new, whatever, that's not related to your area of expertise.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I've just pretty recently finished a history of the Pacific War, um, and it's a 3-volume series by a naval historian, um,
Wow.
and it's incredibly well written. Just does a good job of like both conveying the social history and then also the military history and really the big characters in the political and the military worlds, both in Japan and the U.S. And I've read a lot of European books, but on the sort of European side of the theater. But the author is Ian Toll, and
Ian Toll, how do you spell
T,
that?
yeah, Ian Toll, Toll, and the book is I think the first book is called The Conquering Tide by Ian Toll. But it's again 3 volumes on the Pacific War, and just incredibly well written and engaging. 3-volume
Wow,
series.
that's a great recommendation.
So
I've started reading on my Kindle app on my phone at the gym. And in during in between sets. Yes, I go to the gym. I know it's not obvious when you look at me. So I've actually been reading more that way. So I'm definitely that's a great one. Well, Brad Wilcox Institute for Family Studies. Thank you very much for your time. This was very interesting. Maybe one day we'll do a longer one. But in the meantime, it was a lot of fun to have you and go catch your flight.
thanks. Great to be with you this morning.